It is my pleasure to introduce Mark Bartel, Chief Strategy Officer of End Food Waste Australia. Mark is a treasure trove of knowledge and an expert in all things sustainability, so I'm pleased that he has agreed to join us to present today's webinar. May I ask if you have any questions throughout Mark's presentation, if you could please submit them in the chat box and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation. Mark is going to be covering quite a lot in the next 40 minutes, so I'm going to hand over to him to begin his presentation.
Christina.
Over to you, Mark.
If you could share the slides, Christina, that would be great.
Yep, just loading. There you go.
Perfect. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. So as Christina said, I'm going to try and cover quite a lot. And I really want to focus on sort of 4 topics. The first one is around the evolution of sustainability and how that's driven changes in corporate practice. The second one is how reducing food loss and waste actually helps to deliver a whole range of different sustainability goals. And I'll talk a bit about some of the work we're doing with our signatories in the Australian Food Pact and with the folks we're working on sector action plans with. I'm then going to switch into food waste and climate specifically and just talk about a bit of our work with the industry and where we feel that's going and where we think it's going to be useful. And then a short concluding segment, which is really taking a look at what is going on in agriculture and some of the emerging best practice, particularly around collaboration and landscape scale. That really isn't easy to say, management of sustainability issues and what that means for sustainable sourcing of food and commodities. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into it. Just talk a little bit about the work we do at End Food Waste Australia to start with. So we are the largest single R&D organisation tackling food loss and waste in the world now. The End Food Waste Cooperative Research Centre has $123 million at its disposal to do cutting-edge, world-leading research. I've already mentioned that we do a lot of work with industry to take some bold action and to collaborate across the food supply chain through the Australian Food Pact and through a growing number of sector action plans. As Christina's just said, we are launching 3 this week. We also work in partnerships with all levels of government across Australia, with peak industry bodies, sector bodies, and levy bodies as well, to really change the way the food system looks and operates. And a relatively new piece of work that you'll see come to fruition later in the year, we are looking at how do we drive behaviour change, particularly in Australian households and in some aspects of food businesses as well. So you'll see a bit later on in the presentation, I kind of reference some of that new work around behaviour change. There's a bit of a time lag on these slides, I think. Here we go. So just to start with, I wanted just to kind of reflect on, I've been working in the sustainability space for nigh on 40 years now, and this is kind of a reflection that I've had in presenting to a number of conferences recently around, where did sustainability come from in the corporate space? How do we talk about and address sustainable development now? And the journey for me was really right back in the 1980s. And we saw really the first definition of sustainable development. And it really flagged to me the long-term intergenerational nature of sustainability and sustainable development. And that definition there of sustainability, the capacity for continuance into the long term, I think sometimes we kind of forget about that when we are working on sustainability programs. It really has to be a long-term thing and not something necessarily driven by, quarterly shareholder reports, for example. So this is the starting point for my journey, I guess, this taking this really long-term view. Okay. So then what we saw emerging from that in about 1994 was this concept of the triple bottom line. And that was all around how do we measure financial, social, and environmental performance of any corporation over a period of time. And the key thing I think from this was, and this is from the Economist's kind of definition of it, that only a company that produces a triple bottom line is really taking account of the full cost involved in doing business. And an old friend of mine, John Elkington, who used to run a pretty amazing consultancy called Sustainability in Europe, his view on this was also it was supposed to provoke kind of deeper thinking around capitalism and its future, because we weren't just talking about money anymore. Sorry about that. So then in around the late 1990s, we started talking about corporate social responsibility. And this really was around providing a stronger focus on the sort of social and ethical dimensions of sustainability. So we started talking more about employee rights, about stronger environmental protection, about how do we improve supply relationships and supply chain resilience, how do we get communities involved in what we do as businesses. So this for us was just a really different way of viewing sustainability, bringing that social, ethical dimension to the core of what we do. And then we started talking about the relationship between the different aspects of capital that we started off the conversation around in the triple bottom line, but we broadened it out, and we called this the five capitals model. And really, it was about bringing together all of the aspects of businesses, so the human capital, the financial capital, the social capital, the manufactured capital. But critical to this was that all of those capitals, there was a recognition that all of those capitals depended on natural capital. And I think this conversation really took us to a very interesting place around corporate accountability as well. And we started to talk about issues around transparency, responsiveness to stakeholders, and ensuring you're compliant with rules and law. So this was really the first attempt to start thinking about, what we're seeing now in terms of, nature-related financial disclosures and the discussion around that, but the importance of natural capital to all the other capitals. Then, of course, we had the UN Sustainable Development Goals introduced in 2015. And the purpose of these goals really was to provide a compass to businesses and governments on what was important to address in order to deliver a more sustainable world. And these 17 UN SDGs, UN Sustainable Development Goals, really do interact in a way that I will share with you a bit later on in this presentation. But a lot of businesses are now using this as a framework, the SDGs as a framework to both prioritize their work and to report on it when they're looking at sustainability programs. And then more recently, we've seen the introduction of corporate governance through ESG. And so this kind of goes back to a bit of the triple bottom line, to a bit of the CSR stuff, and to a broader reflection on the UN SDGs. But it really brings corporate governance into the core of sustainability and sustainability management in a way that perhaps wasn't there before. So what we've seen is that movement away from the longer term view to a much clearer understanding of what sustainability looks like in the round, and then incorporating that governance dimension to it as well. So why do we, as organizations, as corporations, focus on sustainability? And I think, this is a pretty good list of the kind of business benefits of sustainability. And this is actually a list that's been around for some time, more than 20 years. And it comes out of a European report called Buried Treasure. So what we see is a lot more organizations seeking to deliver these benefits in their sustainability programs. But it's not just about the business benefits. It's about some of the hard science we are starting to see and the effect that some of our operations and activities are having on the world. And when I first saw this kind of principle of planetary boundaries, and this is a piece of work that the Stockholm Environment Institute's been working on for some time. It was first introduced, I think, around 2009. And at that point, there were 3 of the 9 planetary boundaries that they had considered breached. In other words, we were outside of our safe operating space. This is an update on the planetary boundaries from last year, from a peer-reviewed scientific paper. And what we see here now is 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached, and some of them quite severely, like biosphere integrity. And when I look at this and I look at I guess the enormity of global food loss and waste and project that onto these planetary boundaries, global food loss and waste accounts for 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Another way of looking at that is that it also represents 50%, so 1/2 of all emissions from global food systems. We are utilising 25% of all the water used in agriculture and close to that in fertiliser on the earth. We're wasting a cropland area the size of China, and food waste consumes effectively 1 in 4 of all food value, of all food calories available on the planet. And when we look at the biodiversity loss, what we see from most of the international peer-reviewed literature is that agriculture alone is responsible for close to 85% of all biodiversity loss if we are not, managing the food system well. So this, for me, starts to link these broader, deep science-based issues around our planet and our relationship with it, with the impact of food waste on those planetary boundaries. The other thing that kind of drives us really is this notion of the perfect storm. And this was first introduced by a number of chief government scientists in Europe, but I think is now being reflected in Australia and New Zealand. And it kind of brings together, what we might describe as the food, energy, and water nexus and the impact of climate change on what we're trying to achieve. So if we look out just 6 years' time away now, we've seen a growth in demand for food of 50%. We'll see an increased demand for fresh water of 30% and something like a 50% increase in energy use. And that's against a backdrop of, growing climate risks to our food system. If you look at the left-hand side of this slide, these are some of the other stresses in that perfect storm. So we're seeing increasing global population. That'll sit at around 8.6 billion people by 2030. And importantly, within that global population, a very large proportion now will be in a growing middle class, so 5.4 billion people. And that middle class will have aspirations for a much more varied and nutritious diet than perhaps they're experiencing right now. And that will place increasing stress on our global food system too. We're also seeing increasing levels of urbanization. So nearly 2/3 of the global population will be living in urban and peri-urban environments by 2030. And that not only creates situations where we've got super concentrations of population, but we are slowly, through urban expansion and peri-urban expansion, denuding our ability to grow food close to those urban centres. We've also got some challenges still around our ability to alleviate poverty, and the UN recently reported that the UN SDG UN SDG 2 and 3, which are around poverty and zero hunger. We're still expecting, with all the efforts that are going on at the moment, for about 7% of the global population to be experiencing food poverty and hunger in 2030. And from a climate risks perspective, those climate risks that we used to consider to be 1 in 100 year events, the global average is now that they've become 1 in 30 year events. And if you're living in Australia, like most of us are, you're talking about every year or every other year, those really extreme weather events and the impact they're having on our food system. It's been quite an extraordinary 5 years, from the black summer to the floods and droughts to some of the extreme weather we've seen recently. So this is really what drives our work, and particularly because we see that in reducing food loss and waste, we can help to improve the situation and maybe diminish some of the effects of this perfect storm. So what is going on in terms of the food waste space and its interaction with the UN SDGs? And what we're seeing here is that we have now a target in the UN SDGs, target 12.3, and that is to halve per capita global food waste at retail and consumer levels in the food chain, and also to be able to show a meaningful reduction in food losses from farm to retail or farm to wholesale. And that includes those post-harvest losses. So this is a pretty big challenge, and I'll going to just talk a bit more about the situation in Australia. But the good news is that in achieving a halving of food waste by 2030, you're also helping to deliver 14 of the 17 other UN Sustainable Development Goals. So again, there's a lot of connectivity between working on food loss and waste and all of these other sustainability issues that we face. So in Australia, we have followed that international commitment under the UN SDGs, and we have established a 50% reduction goal. But one thing I should kind of mention here is that the way in which the Australian government defined food waste as being all food not consumed in the entire production and consumption chain means that when we look at the target for Australia, we're not just talking about halving food waste in Australia by 2030, we're talking about halving food loss and waste in Australia by 2030. And that makes the target a lot more difficult for us to deliver. I believe we're the only country that has set such a difficult target in the world. So this presents us with a very interesting challenge. And in terms of where we're at, the National Food Waste Strategy Feasibility Study, which was published towards the end of 2021, really clearly shows we have a significant challenge here. About 7.6 million tonnes of food is wasted each year in Australia. That's equivalent to filling up the MCG 10 times every year. It has a very significant economic effect on the Australian economy as well. So close to $37 billion of food is wasted every year. And we're also talking around about 3.5% of Australia's national greenhouse gas emissions as being associated with that food loss or waste. Just a few other facts and stats on the left-hand side of this slide. So one of the things we talk about a lot in our work is that there's a really good business case for preventing food waste. So the cost-benefit analysis that was undertaken in the feasibility study showed us that for every dollar invested by industry in preventing food loss or waste, there is a $7 to $21 return. And the difference in that range really depends on your location in this food supply chain and to what degree you've added value to food from farm to fork. The other thing to note is that 70% of all of that food, so 5.32 million tonnes, was edible. So if it had been managed better, it could have provided up to 10.64 billion meals every year. Now that really catches my attention and a lot of my colleagues' attention, because right now in Australia, we see that 3.7 million households have experienced moderate to severe food insecurity in the last 12 months. That's 36% of all Australian households, and we're wasting this amount of food. The water footprint associated with this food waste is also equivalent to 5 times the volume of water in Sydney Harbour. That's close to 2,600 gigalitres. That's actually more than the current freshwater deficit in the Murray-Darling Basin, if that's another way of normalising it. And we're utilising a landmass greater than the state of Victoria to grow this food that then gets wasted. So again, a lot of opportunities here, not just to reduce food waste, but to save our precious natural resources and to feed more people. So I just wanted to give you some insight into how that food waste is spread across the value chain. So the bar at the bottom, you can see in the coding at the bottom there, so 22% of our food is lost or wasted in primary production. To put that into numbers for that particular segment, it's close to 1.7 million tonnes of food doesn't actually make it past a farm gate or anywhere near a plate. 17% occurs in food processing and manufacturing, 3% in distribution and cold chain, 7% in wholesale and retail, a whopping 32%, so nearly a third of food wasted in Australian homes, and then a further 19% at the consumption end of the supply chain in the profit and in the for-profit and not-for-profit sectors of hospitality and food service. So it's a very unusual food waste profile in Australia. In most other OECD countries, we would expect to see somewhere in the order of 65 to 80% of the food wasted at the consumption stage. But because we are such a large producer of food, we see a more even distribution across the value chain, which means we have to collaborate a lot more to move the dial and halve food waste. And the boxes above just show some of the work that we are doing to address food waste across the value chain, again, color-coded to the particular supply chain stage with the percentages in below. So our sector action plans are SAPs, where they're operating in the value chain. Some of the major projects we're doing around things like trading practices, date labeling and food storage advice to improve the information provided to consumers so that they are better informed and able to save more food in the home, right the way through to the tech sphere and what app and tech can we bring into play to reduce food waste. A lot of measurement and decision-making tools as well. So a very kind of broad picture of some of the work we're already doing, just to give you an idea of how we're trying to address food loss and waste across the value chain. And one of the things I should mention as well, there's 5 ways really you can create value from surplus and wasted food. And obviously preventing it in the first place is a great thing to do. Redistributing it to people, so to food rescue, to provide meals to those in need, or if it's not suitable for human consumption, to stock feed, so we get a direct and indirect feedback into the human food chain. There's also a lot of really interesting work going on around upcycled food, so actually taking some of that material from surplus or wasted food and creating new products. So anything from taking wasted bread to create or brew beer, through to taking the spent brewer's grain from the brewing process, where it's largely had the sugar removed, and creating low glycemic flours for use in the bakery industry. So really starting to think about the circular economy and the food system as well. But there are other inputs into agriculture, so composting, anaerobic digestion, those sorts of things which can help improve soil health. And then we can also take those materials to create new products that are outside of the food system, so packaging, for example, or to create bioenergy through anaerobic digestion, for example. A little stat at the beginning of the slide that just sort of indicates the rapid growth of the upcycled food market worldwide. So we used to talk about the upcycled food market being worth about $47 billion by 2025, and what we've seen in the latest market forecasts, that's doubled pretty much to $97 billion by 2030. So some real opportunities there to add value to that surplus food and some of the materials coming out of sideways streams in manufacturing, for example. So one of the things we talk about a lot in our work is how do we bring people together to collaborate, and voluntary agreements are a really good way of doing that. We've seen voluntary agreements now emerge in around 30 countries from around the world. Some of them just focus on food waste, some of them focus on food and packaging waste, some of them focus on other things as well, like climate. But we believe we're a strong advocate of voluntary agreements. We think they really form a really useful platform to bring food businesses together, and not just with their peers or with their supply partners, but also connecting business to government so that we can actually get to a situation where policy change can help to drive change in business. We also find that when companies come together and start working together, it drives new innovation across the sector as well, and we create more of a longer-term transformation in food supply. It also means that we can enable the sharing of best practice between companies where they're able to do so, but critically also it allows the sharing of data. And one of the things that we often find in working anywhere in sustainability, much less, the food chain, is that data can be very sparse. And so by working across the food chain, we can get much more transparency around things like food loss and waste hotspots, and what to do about them. So the Australian Food Pact is our own voluntary agreement in Australia. I'm going to talk a bit about that now. So it allows us to partner with food and drink businesses across the whole of the supply chain. We work with businesses to create tailored food waste action plans. So we help them to quantify food loss and waste. We identify those hotspots in their own operations and in their own supply chains. We provide some expert support to them to help them find solutions to those hotspots. We've got a growing toolkit as well of best practice tools and templates that we work with businesses on. And when we get to things like tackling supply chain hotspots, we really there looking at how do we measure, how do we highlight those hotspots, how do we look at root causes, and how do we build those solutions. And that really turns some of those losses into opportunities and recognition for effort, really. The other thing we do a lot of, as I've said before, is we are seeking not just to reduce food waste, but to reduce food insecurity. So we've seen some really impressive efforts from the signatories to the Australian Food Pact around food donation. But critically, I think what we're able to provide is a safe operating space for pre-competitive collaboration industry-wide that allows our signatories to share their problems and challenges with each other and to come up with shared solutions as well. So just to give you an overview, for those of you who are not familiar with the Pact, there are 4 kind of programs that we operate. In the top left corner of the slide here, you'll see we are starting to do a bit more work now around how do we go right back to basics. So if someone is developing or designing a new food product, how do we make sure that's designed with food waste in mind and not necessarily just about factory or retail waste, but how can food businesses help consumers to reduce the amount of food waste they have at home through product design? We're also looking at sourcing practices as well, and one of the things that we're looking at in our trading practices program at the moment is how can we get more food businesses to look at whole crop harvest and whole crop purchase. And those sorts of trading practices can really drive some quite dramatic increases in crop utilisation and improve the resilience of the food chain by introducing more food into it. One of the things that we have found very popular as well is working across supply chains. We call it our Walk the Chain program. And that's where we bring the supply partners together with a key customer and look at all of those food waste hotspots in the supply chain. In the bottom right, we're doing a growing body of work around changing behaviours in food chains and in Australian homes. And I think the Pact and the signatories there are really keen to explore how they can work to benefit consumers. And we have a nationwide consumer behaviour change campaign launching later in the year. And I think that's really going to bring this whole part of the Pact to life. And then in the bottom left, this is where we look at what is the innovation drivers to achieve new upcycled foods, to maximise the potential for donation to food rescue and to stock feed. So these are some of our signatories to the Pact. You'll see there we've got some of the major food retailers, the major manufacturers there as well, and some of the largest catering and hospitality and food service companies too. We also have supporting signatories who provide us with access to memberships or access to their sectors, and you'll see there's a good representation there from the food rescue sector. We also have solution providers that work with our food businesses and help them to measure and reduce their food loss and waste as well. So just to give you an idea of the kind of impact of the pact, and this is just from last year. So last year we were able to reduce the amount of waste in our signatory companies in terms of the percentage of food handled. You can imagine there is a lot of food handled by those large food retailers, caterers, and food manufacturers. And we were able to reduce that food waste percentage by 1% in across 2021 and 2022, 2023. We also spent a lot of time moving food up the food recovery hierarchy, and we've got an estimated saving there of about $60 million by repurposing food that would otherwise have been wasted. And they've been able to donate an incredible 135 million meals in the last year and reduce GHG savings by reducing food waste, equivalent to taking 50,000 cars off the road, which is pretty impressive as the second year. I'll talk very briefly about our sector action plans, and these are really great opportunities to bring together broader collaborations. So, for example, in our horticulture sector action plan, which is about to launch next week, we're working with, I think, about 32 organisations. So we're working with major farmers, growers, retailers, Hort Innovation Australia, sector bodies like the Banana Council, Melons Australia as well. So these are really good opportunities to bring together major players in particular sectors of the food industry. And we're looking, as the diagram on the left suggests, we're looking at what policy levers can we pull, what R&D is required, what is the implementation support those organisations might need. It's also about building communities of practice. Very often we find that there's a shortage of expertise in the sectors we're working in terms of their appreciation or knowledge of how to reduce food waste. So a big part of this is also about building capacity and capability through delivering these sector action plans. So I'm just going to get in, just talk very briefly about our work in climate and linking that to food loss and waste. And for us, there are some very tangible connections between food loss and waste and between climate action. So we know, we're now living on a planet with over 8 billion people. We have less than 6 years now to deliver that halving food waste target. We can see in a number of sectors that the food system is definitely a contributor to that national inventory. We also see we've got quite a lot of challenges. So if we look at the Climate Authority's recent reports, we can see that we're already in a situation in Australia where average land temperatures have increased by 1.4 degrees Celsius. Average regional sea temperatures have also increased by 1.1 degrees Celsius, both since 1910. So we are pretty much guaranteed to already breach that 1.5 degrees Celsius that is required to deliver net zero. And last year, globally, we saw the first year where global temperatures on average were breaching that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold that's we're trying to achieve or deliver in the Paris Agreement. And right now, the Climate Authority's statement was there is no indication that our current emissions trajectory will allow for net zero emissions to be achieved by mid-century. So it's a pretty sobering thought, this. So how can we bring together the different scopes that organisations are measuring, and what is the kind of scale of what we could do? So we know that the food supply chain is responsible for about 26% of GHG emissions annually. That would go up to close to 34% if we looked at land use and land use change as a result of food production. But we can also see that there is a real opportunity as a food industry to improve the situation, improve the sustainability and resilience of agriculture and aquaculture systems, look at how we improve resource productivity and efficiency, look at how we can generate healthy and sustainable diets that are affordable and accessible to all, and of course, the renewable energy transition. So when we talk about emissions, we tend to talk about 3 scopes, and this is really just to kind of describe these and summarize them. So scope 1, direct emissions from a company's own operations, their processes, their products, their services. Scope 2, indirect, so it's all the energy and heat that they're using. And Scope 3, which is the challenging space where a lot of food businesses are finding themselves right now, is looking at the indirect emissions in the upstream supply chain, but also the downstream. So how are their products being used by consumers and transported to consumers, and what impact does that have on the footprint of their organization? And this is deeply challenging stuff, but really worthwhile, because very often we find that the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions in the food system are actually occurring in the supply chain. And certainly that's the case that we've seen with the Carbon Disclosure Project, which is collecting a lot of this data, this Scope 3 data. And you can see here nearly over 11 times higher emissions in food supply chains than in the own operations of a business. And the example here from Coca-Cola, 93% of their total emissions in their footprint are from the supply chain. So what are we doing about it? We are in the process of finalizing a Scope 3 measurement and reporting protocol under the Australian Food Pact, and that is specifically being developed to guide food and drink businesses through this process. We're doing a whole load of work around emission factors for Australian food systems, but also looking at how do we report this to those three main supplier questionnaire platforms for Scope 3 as well. We're also producing a net zero package, which I won't go into too much detail, but there'll be some general net zero guidance, a net zero roadmap, which will start off being generic, but then we are going to be generating some roadmaps for specific supply chain stages and subsectors, and some supporting chapters to support those roadmaps. And they're kind of based on some work in the UK around how do you get companies to start the net zero journey, how do you get them to build, and then how do you get them into a leadership position. And this is our kind of roadmap for doing that. Our ultimate goal here is to really move to a situation where we can actually build a market so we can generate carbon credits based off of maintaining, keeping food in the human food system. So just to conclude, I just wanted to talk about a few things that are starting to emerge from around the world. So the first is talking about the farm of the future, and this kind of blend of precision agriculture and agri-food technology with more traditional systems. And we're seeing a lot of this now being adopted in Australia, but this is pretty incredible stuff, and it's got a real role to play in reducing food loss on farm and food waste through the value chain as well. But it's going to be, I think, this unique blend of tech and traditional farming practices, and things like agroforestry and ecological farming systems that are going to help us to get to a point where we see a more sustainable production system, but one that also produces a lot less waste and loss. And then finally, I think what we are starting to see in other countries as well is this focus on landscape scale management. And some people are starting to call this Scope 4. So if you want to source sustainably food ingredients or commodities from a landscape, how can you determine that your wheat is sustainable when you may be sharing an area of land with others in a crop rotation? And the way in which the crop rotation operates may influence how sustainable your wheat crop is, for example. So this is about collaboration across the landscape scale, so ignoring some of those traditional farm boundaries, but also getting into conversations and dialogues around the multiple uses of a landscape as well. So how can we use grazing land, for example, as green infrastructure for flood alleviation? How can we increase the pollinators in an environment to deliver a better crop yield or an orchard yield? And how do we use the outputs like manures from dairy farming or beef farming to provide the nutrients into the farming system? So this is a much more holistic view of things. It is starting to emerge now, this notion of having to collaborate to make sure that the materials, the foods, the ingredients you're sourcing from a landscape are able to be sustainably sourced and are regenerating our land and our soils at the same time as meeting the wider needs of society. So to conclude, everything really is connected. The sustainability agenda has really evolved over the last 40 years and by changing priorities and stakeholder needs, and this will not change. What we have seen from the highest performing companies in sustainability is that they've moved out of silos. They're empowering those on the front line, whichever corporate function they might be in or whichever supplier function they might be in, and they're managing, helping those people on the front line with providing specialist support. Increasingly, they're working in multidisciplinary teams to utilize their collective corporate knowledge and expertise. They're measuring a lot more because they know that what gets measured gets managed, and they're improving their quality over time of their data. They're using sustainability hotspots to prioritize action and deliver impact as well, and noticing that their sustainability issues are connected, and they're looking for those links to accelerate their progress across multiple sustainability metrics and targets. And they're collaborating a lot more perhaps than they used to as well to tackle those common challenges. They're also taking increasingly that whole chain view, and they're recognizing that if they try and reduce or try and improve the sustainability of one part of the supply chain, maybe they might actually be pushing the problem up or down the supply chain if they're not taking a holistic view of the food system. Wow, that seemed like a really quick ramble through this. I'm gonna, if you can stop sharing now, Christina, I'm very happy to take any questions anyone might have.
Thank you, Mark. That was fantastic. We have quite a few questions that have come through, so I'm just going to pick out a couple with the last few minutes that we have. This question was in relation to reducing food waste in Australia. Can you please elaborate on how every dollar invested gives the return of approximately $7 to $21? And is this figure related to industry council or other?
So the variance, as I said earlier, really depends on where you are on the supply chain. So if you're at the farm gate, then you're probably closer to the $7 range. If you're in premium hospitality, then you're probably going to be close to the $21 range. The ways in which you deliver those can be very, very different depending on where you are on the supply chain. So a lot of the things I've literally just talked about in agriculture in terms of increasing the use of data, increasing the use of remote sensing, aerial sensing, precision agriculture can really significantly reduce losses in agriculture. And we're seeing that play through now. We're seeing a bit more experimentation in varietals as well. In manufacturing, we're starting to see now some fairly major investments in Australian food manufacturing, and they're adopting what the Europeans would call Industry 4 and Industry 5 technology. So this is the ability to link the physical backbone of a manufacturing site with a digital backbone. So, for example, there's real-time sensing on the production line that will tell you when something is going wrong. So maybe there's the wrong mix of ingredients or an ingredient has been missed from a product. Now, in traditional manufacturing, you may have found before that you've possibly got through thousands of units of product before quality assurance and quality testing have realized that there's been a problem. With Industry 4, the system itself senses the mix of those ingredients and the quantities of those within that mix and immediately sends an alarm or a notification to the line engineer that something's not right. And rather than potentially having to rework thousands of units of product, the chances are you're probably reworking less than 100. So these are really smart systems. They allow you to mass customize products as well. They allow for better line changes between different product lines. In retail, what we're seeing is a lot more focus on data and the availability of data. We've seen particularly the two largest retailers in Australia starting to look at the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in things like demand forecasting and order fulfillment with suppliers. And even in the home, we're starting to see what the role of packaging innovation and better information on packaging is to help consumers to properly use and store food at home and so on. I've just seen a question come in on product design. So let me get to that one as well. So what we've seen in product design is, so there's a couple of angles to that. So in some of the work I've done around sustainable product design, we tend to start at the basics. So what are the ingredients? What is the market? What is it the consumer is looking for? We've certainly seen situations in the past where a product is developed and the first time any sort of engagement, direct consumer engagement takes place is in tasting and testing. And at that point, it may have taken quite a long time to get a product to market. So one of the things we do in the design process is bring consumers into that and much sooner in the process. We get a much clearer sense of what it is they're looking for. We also look at what the consumer need is. So, for example, in most markets I've worked in, and I've worked in about 17 or 18 now, single and low occupancy households are typically underserved in the retail space. In other words, the products they are buying are too big for their needs. And when you tack onto that the shelf life, or particularly the open shelf life of multiple use products, you're creating situations where A, a consumer may be opening a pack that's too big for them, and B, they've got a very limited amount of time in which to consume that pack. So the kind of product size, the pack size, the opportunities to be a bit more flexible in how you present the product is one thing. The other thing we find is that when we look at food waste hotspots, as you're moving from development kitchen into commercial production, it's very often really useful to see where those hotspots are in terms of food waste and what you can do about that through ingredient change or through changes in process. So there's so many things you can do in the design.
Thanks, Mark. I might just get to one more question that we've got here about thoughts on government policy and implementing penalties for FMCG companies who have high food waste.
Wow. That's a really tricky one. So, I mean, it's funny, it's not so much in the FMCG manufacturing space we've seen this, but certainly in other countries we have seen legislation come in. I think it started off in France, for example, where retailers were, where food is still suitable for human consumption, they were told they could no longer send it to landfill, it had to go to food rescue. That created quite significant change, but also some quite significant pain, because the timeline for that sort of change was quite short, and the food rescue organisations in France were really struggling with a dramatic increase in the volume of food that was being donated through supermarkets. So it should really have been a longer introduction period and provided the opportunity for food rescue organisations to get some more investment from the industry to improve their capacity and capability to handle those sorts of dimensions. I haven't yet seen a country that has actually implemented any regulation that penalises food businesses for producing food loss and waste, but there are a growing number of countries that are putting in place mandatory reporting of food loss and waste. And this is also true across the European Union. There's the debate on that is going through right now. So immediately you'll see 20 plus countries in Europe adopting the requirement for annual reporting on food loss and waste. In the UK, where I started my food waste journey, Tesco, the largest retailer there, were probably the bravest. They put their heads above the parapet and they published their food loss and waste data over 11 years ago. That was a really brave thing to do because no one else was doing it. And what Tesco have achieved since then, they got about 130 of their major suppliers to do the same. And that has led to a dramatic increase in collaboration across the food chain to tackle loss and waste wherever it occurs. And that has been a spectacular success. And we would obviously love to see a bit more transparency here, but we acknowledge that there's a nervousness in the industry about putting figures out there, although we have seen some of our signatories recently do that. But it would be great because I think once you're starting to find yourself in the territory where you feel it is safe to share, you have found yourself in a place on the food loss and waste journey where you know you need help, not just from us, but from other businesses, from supply partners, from government. And that, I think, we would all welcome.
Thank you again, Mark. Thanks so much for your time today. We didn't get to a couple of the questions, but if we have your contact details through your registration, we'll reach out to you with an answer. Just to close out, I just wanted to bring up that we are hosting the National Food Waste Summit in Melbourne on the 24th and 25th of July this year. Tickets are on sale now, and it's a good chance to take the opportunity for the early bird rate as well as a special discount offer for Food Waste Action Week. You're welcome to sign up to our newsletter to find out more information. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today. The recording will be made available via email through to all registrants. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Great to have you along this afternoon.